It was a humid summer evening in a small Texas town, nestled between the vast fields and endless skies. The fading sun painted the horizon with shades of orange and purple, as if the earth itself was setting its final farewell for the day. At first glance, the town appeared quiet, peaceful even, but beneath the surface, things were far from calm. Behind closed doors, the delicate fabric of a marriage was falling apart, unraveling with every passing moment. Pastor David Thompson had been the town's beacon of faith for over a decade. His tall frame, neatly trimmed beard, and soft-spoken demeanor made him a respected figure in the community. He was the man who spoke of hope and redemption every Sunday, leading the congregation in prayers and hymns. His voice was a comfort to the people who sought solace in the church pews. But what most of the town didn't know was that David's life was a fragile illusion, and his marriage to Carla, his high school sweetheart, was built on secrets and lies. Carla Thompson was everything David had ever wanted: beautiful, charming, and intelligent. They had been married for 15 years and had two children, both teenagers. Their life seemed perfect from the outside. But in recent years, things had started to change. Carla had become distant, her laughter fading, her smile less frequent. David noticed the late nights she spent out, the phone calls she would take in private, and the way her eyes seemed to dart nervously when he questioned her about her whereabouts. Then came the revelation that shattered David's world. One evening, after a long day of meetings at the church, David came home to find a message on his phone. It was an anonymous tip, the kind that people often send when they know too much and don't want to get involved. The message contained pictures of Carla, his wife, climbing into the truck of another man. The man in question was none other than Jason Mitchell, a local mechanic who had recently moved into town. David had noticed him around a few times, but never suspected anything more than a simple acquaintance. The pictures were taken at night, so the quality wasn't perfect, but there was no mistaking the intimacy in the way Carla and Jason were standing close to each other. In one picture, Jason had his arm around her waist. In another, they were laughing together. It wasn't just a friendly interaction. It was something more. David's hands trembled as he stared at the phone screen, his heart sinking into his stomach. He needed answers, but Carla wasn't home. He waited, pacing the living room, hoping for some explanation. But when she finally arrived, it wasn't the confrontation he was expecting. Carla didn't apologize, nor did she deny anything. Instead, she seemed strangely calm, almost too calm. "I need to tell you something, David," she said, her voice flat. "Jason and we've been seeing each other for months. I'm sorry, but I can't continue living this lie. I don't love you anymore." David felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath him. His mind raced, trying to comprehend the weight of her words. His wife, his partner, his confidant, had been unfaithful, and not just in the casual sense. It was a full-fledged affair. And as the conversation continued, Carla revealed something even more shocking. "I'm sorry, David, but it's not just the affair. Jason, he's been honest with me about something. We both have HIV. I didn't know how to tell you, but I had to. It's too late now." The room seemed to close in on David. The walls grew smaller, suffocating him. Carla's betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was physical too. She had knowingly put him at risk. As the truth settled in, a storm of emotions raged inside him. Anger, hurt, betrayal, and fear all mixed into a volatile cocktail that threatened to consume him. David didn't know what to do. His mind was reeling, his body numb. All he could think about was the disease, the constant reminder of his wife's infidelity. And Jason. He had been part of this destruction. David felt his world crumbling around him, and for the first time in years, he was alone. That night, as the tension between David and Carla reached its peak, she left the house to meet Jason. She had promised him that they would be together, no matter the consequences. David watched from the window as Carla climbed into the truck with Jason and drove off into the night. What happened next would forever change the course of their lives and the town's perception of the quiet pastor. Around 10:30 p.m., a call came into the local police station. A man reported an accident on the outskirts of town. A truck had run off the road and struck a tree. The vehicle was badly damaged, and two people were inside. One was dead on impact. The other was in critical condition, barely breathing. The police arrived at the scene within minutes. The truck was an old Chevy, its front end smashed against the trunk of a large oak tree. The driver, Jason Mitchell, was unconscious but alive, his face bloodied and bruised. In the passenger seat was Carla Thompson, her body lifeless, her head resting against the shattered window. The first responders did what they could, but Carla was beyond saving. The paramedics pronounced her dead at the scene. Jason, however, was rushed to the hospital where he would later survive but remain in a coma for several days. The town was shaken by the news. It was a tragedy, one that seemed to come out of nowhere. The local sheriff's office quickly began its investigation, but something didn't sit right with Deputy Sarah O'Connor, the seasoned investigator who had seen her fair share of accidents. This didn't feel like a typical crash. There were too many unanswered questions. As the investigation unfolded, the sheriff's department uncovered something unsettling. David Thompson, the beloved pastor, had been the last person to see Carla alive. They had spoken earlier that evening. A phone call, a heated argument. But what really caught Sarah's attention was the fact that David had been seen near the scene of the crash, just minutes before the truck veered off the road. It was a tragic accident, or so it seemed at first. But as Sarah dug deeper into the lives of David, Carla, and Jason, she started to uncover a web of lies, deceit, and betrayal that no one could have imagined. The small town, once so peaceful, was about to be shaken to its core. And at the center of it all was a pastor whose life had been torn apart, a wife whose betrayal had led to her death, in a community that would never be the same again. Deputy Sarah O'Connor had been with the sheriff's office for over 10 years. She had seen it all, the tragic accidents, the petty crimes, the desperate acts of violence. But nothing about the crash that killed Carla Thompson sat right with her. It wasn't just the obvious signs of foul play. There was something in the air that she couldn't quite put her finger on. In her experience, accidents didn't happen by chance. There were always patterns, always signs, and always stories behind the scenes. Sarah was known for her keen eye for detail. While most of her colleagues were quick to label an incident and move on, she always took the extra step, digging deeper, asking the tough questions, and searching for the cracks where the truth might leak out. In this case, with its strange circumstances and unsettling undercurrent, had all the markings of something that required a closer look. She was one of the first to arrive at the crash scene that night. The moonlight cast long shadows on the twisted wreckage of the truck, and the smell of burning rubber still lingered in the air. The headlights of the patrol cars illuminated the scene, where a few officers were already taking statements from witnesses. A handful of onlookers had gathered at a distance, most whispering about the tragedy that had just unfolded. It was all too raw, too fresh. The news would spread fast in their tight-knit town. Jason Mitchell was unconscious, his face bruised, a deep gash on his forehead, and his body covered in cuts and abrasions. He was still alive, barely, though the paramedics had put him in a medically induced coma in hopes of stabilizing him. They were confident he would survive, but no one knew when he would wake up or if he would remember the events leading up to the crash. Carla Thompson's body had already been removed, and Sarah had been to the morgue to see it for herself. The reports confirmed what Sarah had suspected. Carla's cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with the violent impact of the crash. But there was something strange about her position in the truck. Her seatbelt was undone, and she was slumped against the shattered window, as if she hadn't been wearing it properly. Normally, when someone is ejected from a vehicle, the seatbelt provides the necessary protection to prevent serious injury or death. But Carla's body suggested she hadn't been in her seat properly when the truck collided with the tree. Sarah's mind began to piece together the clues. It wasn't just an accident. It couldn't be. The sheriff's office had already begun questioning David Thompson, the pastor, who was the first logical person to speak with. He had, after all, been the last one to have contact with Carla. The sheriff had done the initial questioning, and while David had seemed devastated by the loss of his wife, there was a subtle tension in his words. He claimed to have no idea how the crash had happened and insisted he had been at home when it occurred. But Sarah knew there was more to the story. His reaction was too measured, too calm for someone who had just lost their spouse in such a tragic manner. After the initial interviews with David, Sarah asked to speak with him again. She needed to get a sense of his character. David Thompson was sitting in his small, sterile office at the church when Sarah arrived. He looked haggard, his usually neat appearance now disheveled. His tie hung loose around his neck, and his eyes were red, as though he hadn't slept in days. He stood up when Sarah entered, but his greeting felt off. He seemed less surprised by her presence than she expected. "Deputy O'Connor," he said, his voice steady but distant. "I'm sorry, I'm not sure what else I can tell you. I already spoke with the sheriff." "I know, David," Sarah replied, keeping her voice soft. "But I need to ask you a few more questions. We're just trying to get the full picture. It's important." David nodded slowly, clearly exhausted. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Of course, please. Sit down." Sarah took a seat, her eyes scanning the room. It was filled with books and framed photos of David and his family. There were some religious icons, and the faint scent of incense lingered in the air. The picture of the perfect pastor, the man everyone trusted, the man who spoke about forgiveness, faith, and family every Sunday. Sarah wondered how many people in this town truly knew the man sitting across from her. "I'm not sure how much more I can say," David continued, his voice wavering. I I loved Carla. I still do. But I'm also angry, hurt. She was unfaithful to me. With him. Jason." He paused for a moment, looking out the window, almost as if lost in his own thoughts. "I don't know what happened that night. She left me and I stayed home. I haven't heard from her since. And then I got the call." "I'm sorry for your loss," Sarah said gently, trying to find the right words. She didn't want to show any weakness, but she did feel a twinge of sympathy for him. After all, the man had just lost his wife, and despite the affair, there had been love at one point. "But here's what I don't understand, David," she continued, looking him in the eye. "You told us you were home, but we've spoken with witnesses who saw your truck near the crash site just minutes before it happened. Can you explain that?" David's expression flickered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about. I I wasn't there. I swear to you, I stayed home that night. I don't know what else to say." Sarah leaned in slightly, studying him carefully. His eyes darted to the side for a fraction of a second before he met her gaze again. It was subtle, but it was enough to tell her that there was something he wasn't saying. "I'm not accusing you of anything, David," Sarah said, her tone calm. "But you need to understand that we need to investigate everything. We need to know what happened that night. Not just for Carla, but for you too. You loved her. This isn't easy for anyone involved." David swallowed hard, his lips trembling. "I don't know why she would have done that to me. I was good to her. I never deserved this." His voice broke at the end, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding something back. Something deep. "I'll need to ask you a few more questions soon, David," Sarah said, standing up. "Just remember, we're trying to get to the truth here." As she walked out of the office, Sarah felt the weight of the situation press down on her chest. There were too many contradictions, too many things that didn't make sense. David had a motive, but was it enough to drive him to murder? And if he hadn't been involved in the crash, then why had he been so close to the scene? Sarah knew she had to dig deeper. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form, but she needed more time, more evidence. As the town of Harmony continued to mourn the loss of one of their own, Sarah O'Connor found herself at the center of a storm that was just beginning to rage. And in the midst of the sorrow, she was determined to find the truth, no matter where it led. The next few days felt like a blur to Deputy Sarah O'Connor. She barely had time to eat or sleep as the investigation into Carla Thompson's death continued to unfold. The case had quickly turned from a straightforward accident to something much more complex, and Sarah knew she had to keep her focus sharp if she was going to uncover the truth. As Sarah sifted through the details, one thing became increasingly clear. This wasn't just a simple case of infidelity gone wrong. Something darker was lurking beneath the surface. David Thompson's calm demeanor, his odd reactions when questioned, and the strange way his alibi seemed to fall apart were all suspicious. But there was more to the story, more that Sarah needed to uncover. The first step was to speak with Carla's closest friends. If she could find out more about her relationship with David and about the affair with Jason Mitchell, it might offer some much-needed insight into the events leading up to that tragic night. It was mid-morning when Sarah arrived at Rachel Martin's house. Rachel was one of Carla's best friends. She had known Carla since high school, and according to some of the locals, she had been the person Carla confided in most about her troubled marriage. The small ranch-style home was neat, surrounded by a wide yard full of wildflowers. It looked picturesque, but Sarah knew appearances could be deceiving. Rachel answered the door quickly, her face a mixture of exhaustion and sadness. She had already heard about Carla's death, and the news had hit her hard. It was clear from the moment Sarah introduced herself that Rachel hadn't expected to be dragged into this. "Deputy O'Connor," Rachel said, her voice soft but steady. "I'm still trying to wrap my head around everything. I can't believe she's gone." "I understand this is difficult, Rachel," Sarah said gently, "but I need to ask you some questions about Carla. We're trying to understand what happened. Do you mind if I come in?" Rachel nodded slowly and stepped aside to let Sarah into the living room. The walls were adorned with framed photographs of Rachel and Carla over the years, vacations, birthdays, and even their younger days full of smiles and laughter. The contrast between those happy moments and the tragedy that had now unfolded seemed almost cruel. "I'll try to help however I can," Rachel said, sitting down on the couch and folding her hands in her lap. "But I don't know how much I can tell you. Carla and I hadn't spoken much lately." Sarah took a seat across from her, studying her closely. Rachel's eyes were red, and there were dark circles under them. She had clearly been up all night, but her posture and the way she held herself suggested strength. It wasn't her first brush with tragedy, that was obvious. "When was the last time you saw Carla?" Sarah asked. "It was about a week ago," Rachel replied, her voice wavering slightly. "We had coffee at the diner. It wasn't like our usual chats, though. She was distant, and she wasn't herself, not like I remembered. I asked her if everything was okay, and she just said she was going through a phase. She didn't want to talk much about it, but I could tell something was off." "Did she ever mention anything about problems with David?" Sarah asked, leaning forward. Rachel hesitated. "She didn't say much, but I could tell. Carla always tried to keep up the image of the perfect wife. I think she was trying to convince herself that everything was fine. But I don't know, Sarah. I'm not sure if she was happy. There were times when she seemed like she was suffocating in that marriage." Sarah's mind was already working. Rachel's words aligned with what she had suspected. David had been hiding something, and Carla had been struggling with the burden of it. The fact that she hadn't talked to Rachel about Jason Mitchell spoke volumes. If the affair had been a secret for so long, there must have been a deep shame, or perhaps fear of judgment. "Do you know anything about Jason Mitchell?" "I understand they were seeing each other," Sarah asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. Rachel nodded slowly. "I know about the affair. I didn't know who the guy was at first, but then Carla told me. Jason, he was a mechanic. I think he moved here from somewhere else, but he wasn't exactly a good guy in my opinion. I don't know him well, but Carla, well, she had that look when she talked about him. You know, the kind of look that tells you someone is in love. I just didn't understand it. It didn't make sense." "Why didn't it make sense?" Sarah asked, curious. "I don't know. Carla was always so in love with David. They had a good life, at least that's what she told me. I don't know why she would leave him for someone like Jason. He wasn't the type of man Carla usually went for. He had a reputation, wasn't really someone you'd bring home to meet your parents." It was strange. Rachel paused for a moment, and Sarah could see the wheels turning in her head. "Did Carla ever mention anything about being afraid of David?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet. Rachel's eyes widened. "Afraid of David? No, never. Carla would never have said that, but I did notice something recently. There was this one night a few weeks ago, after church service. Carla seemed a little off, and I asked her if she was okay. She said she'd had an argument with David. She didn't go into specifics, but she did say something that stuck with me. She said, 'If anything happens to me, it's David. He's not what he seems.'" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air like a warning. "Did she ever elaborate on that?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. "Number. That's all she said. It didn't make sense at the time. I didn't think much of it. But now..." Well, it just feels like I missed something important, something big. As Sarah left Rachel's house, she was filled with a heavy sense of foreboding. Rachel's testimony was a crucial piece of the puzzle. Carla had known something was wrong with David long before her death. But what had she meant by her cryptic statement? Was she implying that David had been capable of violence? Or was it simply the bitterness of an affair gone wrong? Sarah didn't know, but she was starting to believe that the past held more answers than she had imagined. The next step was to dig into Jason Mitchell's background. If he was a part of this affair, then his history, too, could reveal important clues. It was time to stop assuming and start uncovering the truth piece by piece. As Sarah drove back to the station, she glanced at the photos of Carla and David on the dashboard, now tainted with suspicion. What had seemed like a simple case of infidelity had become a labyrinth of lies and half-truths, and it was up to her to navigate the maze and uncover the heart of the tragedy. And as much as it pained her, she had a feeling that the darkest secrets were yet to come. The next day, Sarah O'Connor found herself sitting at her desk, staring at the case file in front of her. The investigation had already revealed that the crash wasn't as straightforward as it seemed, and now it was time to delve into the history of the people involved. There were too many unanswered questions, too many gaps in the story. For the first time, she felt the weight of this case pressing down on her. The small town of Harmony had always been known for its peaceful, close-knit community, but now that facade was cracking, revealing a far darker side. Sarah's first move was to dig into Jason Mitchell's background. If Carla had been having an affair with him, then surely his past would provide some context. He was a newcomer to the town, something that, in a place as small as Harmony, didn't go unnoticed. She needed to know who Jason really was, and she needed to get that information fast. She made her way to the town's public records office, a small, worn-down building at the edge of the town square. Inside, the smell of dust and old paper filled the air. The clerk behind the counter was a middle-aged woman with short graying hair. Her glasses slid down her nose as she looked up at Sarah. "Can I help you, deputy?" the woman asked, her voice flat and tired. "I'm looking into a local resident, Jason Mitchell." "I need any public records you have on him," Sarah replied, pulling out her badge and placing it on the counter for emphasis. The clerk hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll need to check, but we don't have much on him. He's only been here for a few months, and his records aren't exactly clean." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" The clerk shrugged. "I'm not saying anything illegal, but he's had a few run-ins with the law. Some petty things, nothing too serious, but it's enough to raise an eyebrow." "Anything specific?" Sarah pressed. The clerk pulled a folder from a filing cabinet and opened it. "Well, there's a charge of assault from a few years ago. He got into a bar fight, but that was dropped. There's also a DUI from when he was living in Houston, and a few small theft charges, but they were all settled out of court." Sarah took note of the information. It wasn't much, but it was enough to paint a picture of a man who had a history of trouble. A man who wasn't afraid to break the law when it suited him. "Thank you," Sarah said, taking the folder and heading out the door. Back at the sheriff's office, Sarah took a deep breath as she reviewed the paperwork. Jason Mitchell's criminal history wasn't extensive, but it was enough to make her wonder if he had been involved in something more than just an affair with Carla. There were indications that he had a temper, that he wasn't someone who shied away from confrontation. The fight at the bar, the DUI, these were signs that Jason wasn't afraid to push the limits. The more Sarah thought about it, the more the puzzle pieces began to shift into place. Carla had left David for this man with a violent streak, a man who had a history of trouble. But why? Why had Carla taken the risk? Did she think Jason could give her something David couldn't? Or was there more to the story that Sarah hadn't uncovered yet? As Sarah's mind raced, she decided it was time to talk to Jason's neighbors. The people who lived closest to him might know more about his behavior and whether he had been involved in anything suspicious in the days leading up to the crash. She wasn't sure if it would reveal anything useful, but she needed to follow every lead. Jason lived in a modest, one-story house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't far from the main road, but it was still secluded enough to give off an air of privacy. The house was surrounded by an overgrown yard, the grass wild and untamed, much like the man who lived there. The paint was peeling on the outside of the house, and there was a noticeable dent in the front door, as if it had been kicked in at some point. Sarah knocked on the door, her boots crunching on the gravel driveway as she waited. After a few moments, the door creaked open. The man who answered was tall, with a scruffy beard and a weathered face. He looked like someone who had spent too many years on the wrong side of life. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gruff. "I'm Deputy O'Connor. I'm investigating the accident that occurred last night. I need to ask you a few questions about Jason Mitchell," Sarah said, keeping her tone polite but firm. The man's expression shifted, a flicker of wariness crossing his face. "Jason? I don't know what you want with him. He's not home right now. Been in the hospital since last night, right?" "Yes, I'm aware," Sarah said. "But I need to know what kind of person he is. Can you tell me anything about him?" The man stepped back slightly, as if considering whether to engage with her further. After a long pause, he spoke. "Look, I don't know much about the guy, okay? He's quiet, keeps to himself, comes and goes at odd hours. But he's had some loud arguments with the missus. I don't know the details, but I've heard them. There was one night, probably about a month ago, when he was yelling at Carla outside. It was real bad. I thought about calling the cops, but then they stopped and things quieted down. I didn't think much of it. Did you ever hear anything specific during these arguments?" Sarah asked, her pulse quickening as she picked up on the possible significance of the neighbor's words. "No, nothing that I could make out. But I heard her shouting something about how he didn't own her, how she wasn't his property." The man continued, his voice lower now, as if speaking of something he knew he shouldn't. "That's important," Sarah muttered to herself. To the neighbor, she said, "Do you have any idea if Jason had a temper? Was he ever violent with her?" The man scratched his chin, looking off into the distance. "I don't know for sure, but like I said, there's been some shouting. I wouldn't be surprised if things got physical sometimes." Sarah nodded, processing the information. This was the first time she had heard of any direct confrontation between Jason and Carla. It was troubling, to say the least. The fact that Jason had a history of violence, combined with the fights with Carla, painted a dangerous picture. But what did it mean for her investigation? She thanked the neighbor and left his house, her mind swirling with new possibilities. If Jason had been abusive, there was a real chance that his actions had escalated the night of the crash. Maybe it wasn't just an affair gone wrong. Maybe it was something much more sinister. As Sarah made her way back to the station, she couldn't shake the feeling that this case was much bigger than she had initially believed. The closer she got to the truth, the more complicated it seemed. But one thing was becoming clear. David Thompson, the man everyone had trusted, was at the center of a tragedy that had been building for years. And somehow Jason Mitchell, the man everyone had seen as an outsider, was the spark that had ignited the fire. Back at her desk, Sarah opened the file on Carla once again. She needed to piece together the final parts of the puzzle, how everything had come to this point. But no matter how much she dug, it was clear to her now that one thing was certain. Someone was lying, and it was her job to figure out who. And as the investigation unfolded, Sarah knew that the answers she sought might come from the most unexpected places. The next morning, Deputy Sarah O'Connor found herself standing in front of the glass windows of the sheriff's office, gazing out at the small town of Harmony. The sun was low in the sky, casting a soft light over the streets, and the town looked peaceful, almost too peaceful for what Sarah was about to dive into. She gathered enough information now, and it was time to confront David Thompson directly. The night before, she had spent hours reviewing all the new evidence she had gathered. Jason Mitchell's criminal history, the neighbor's report about the arguments between Jason and Carla, Rachel Martin's testimony about Carla's fears, and the growing suspicion surrounding David's alibi. Each detail was like a thread, and Sarah was pulling on them one by one. The more she pulled, the more she felt the fabric of this story unraveling. The only problem was that the more she uncovered, the less she was certain about who the true villain was. It had been easy to focus on David at first, the betrayed husband, the angry man who had been humiliated by his wife's affair. But now, with the new information about Jason's violent tendencies and the fights between him and Carla, Sarah's certainty was slipping. There were too many conflicting motives, too many unknowns. David Thompson had to be the key, and Sarah was determined to uncover what lay beneath the surface of his calm demeanor. When Sarah walked into the sheriff's office, she found Sheriff Earl Whitaker sitting at his desk, flipping through some paperwork. He looked up as she entered, his graying beard giving him a stern, but not unfriendly, appearance. "You've been busy, haven't you, Sarah?" he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I've been digging around. I've got some new things to follow up on," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with the exhaustion that had settled in after days of relentless work. "Let me guess," Sheriff Whitaker said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "You're gonna go after David Thompson now, aren't you?" Sarah nodded. "I don't know if he's guilty, Earl, but there's something about him that doesn't sit right. I'm going to confront him today." "Be careful," he warned. "The man's been the town's pastor for years. He's well liked. A lot of folks won't be happy if you start pointing fingers at him. But you know the job, Sarah. You follow the evidence, not the crowd." "I will," Sarah said with a determined nod. "But I can't ignore what I've found. There's too much that doesn't add up." Sheriff Whitaker didn't respond immediately. He simply gave her a knowing look, as if acknowledging the challenge she was facing. "Just don't go in too hot. If he's guilty, we'll find out. If he's not, we'll find out that too." David Thompson's house was not far from the church. It was an old two-story home with a well-kept yard, neatly trimmed hedges, and a white picket fence. To anyone passing by, it was the picture of suburban serenity. It was the kind of house that seemed to belong to a man who had it all together, the kind of man who could stand before a congregation every Sunday and deliver a sermon on faith and forgiveness without a second thought. But Sarah knew there was more to David than the image he projected. When she pulled into the driveway and got out of her car, Sarah noticed the front door was slightly ajar. It was strange. She had expected David to be at the church, or at least at home, but the house seemed oddly empty. She knocked twice, her knuckles rapping against the door. No answer. Sarah pushed the door open just a crack, careful not to make too much noise. "David," she called, her voice carrying through the empty house. No response. She pushed the door open wider, stepping into the hallway. The house was eerily silent. The only sound was the distant ticking of a grandfather clock in the living room. There was a heaviness in the air, like the house itself was holding its breath. "David," she called again, stepping further inside. The house smelled faintly of incense and wood polish, the familiar scent of a home that had been well cared for. A picture on the wall caught her eye. David, his wife Carla, and their two children smiling at the camera. The picture seemed frozen in time, an idyllic family that no longer existed. She heard the sound of footsteps coming from the kitchen, followed by a voice she recognized. "Deputy O'Connor, I wasn't expecting you." David Thompson appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, his expression neutral but his eyes guarded. His shirt was untucked, and he looked like he had been in a hurry. "David," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm, "I need to talk to you about your wife." David's face hardened slightly. "I've already told you everything I know. I'm not here to rehash the details, David, but I've got some new information, and I need you to be honest with me." Sarah's voice was sharp now. She was no longer playing games. "Where were you the night Carla died? Witnesses place your truck near the crash site, but you've told me you were home." David's eyes flickered for a brief moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I was home. I told you that already. You didn't tell me why your truck was seen near the crash site, and I didn't hear an explanation about why your wife was found unbuckled in the passenger seat." Sarah took a step closer. "I think you're hiding something." David's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might snap, but instead he exhaled deeply and ran a hand through his hair. "You think I'm lying? You think I killed her?" "I don't know what to think yet," Sarah said, her voice steady but cold. "But I do know this. Your wife was having an affair with Jason Mitchell. I've spoken to people who saw the two of them together, people who say you and Carla had been fighting for months. Did you know about the fights?" David's eyes darkened. "I knew. She was having an affair. Yes. But I never laid a hand on her. I loved her, and I would never hurt her." "Then why were you so close to the crash site? Why did you lie about your whereabouts?" Sarah pressed. "And why is it that no one has seen you in church since her death?" David shifted uneasily. I didn't lie about my whereabouts. I didn't even know about the crash until after it happened. I've been in a daze, Deputy. I've been grieving. My wife, the mother of my children, is dead. Sarah paused, allowing the words to hang in the air. She studied him carefully. I don't think you're telling me everything, David, but I'll get to the truth. I will. David stood there for a moment, his fists clenched by his sides. You're wrong. You don't know what it's like to be betrayed by the one person you trust the most, to watch everything you've built fall apart. I understand betrayal, Sarah said softly, but I also understand that truth has a way of coming out, even when people try to bury it. David's face paled, his lips pressing together in a thin line. You don't know what you're dealing with, Deputy. You don't know what kind of man you're dealing with. With that, David turned sharply and walked away, retreating down the hall without another word. Sarah stayed where she was, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something in David's tone, something in his words that made her blood run cold. He was hiding something, and whatever it was, it had the power to destroy everything. As Sarah left the house and drove back to the sheriff's office, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into the middle of a much larger story. A story about love, betrayal, and a web of lies that reached far beyond what anyone in Harmony could have imagined. The case had only just begun, and Sarah knew she was only scratching the surface of the truth. The days following her confrontation with David Thompson were tense and filled with unease. Deputy Sarah O'Connor spent her time digging deeper into the details of the case. The more she uncovered, the more convoluted the investigation became. David had always been seen as the steady, reliable pastor of the town, a man of God who had built a life of trust and respect within the community. But Sarah was beginning to question whether that image was merely a facade, hiding darker truths behind it. The further she dug into the personal lives of the Thompsons and their neighbors, the more the pattern of lies, deceit, and betrayal emerged. David's demeanor, cold and controlled, no longer seemed like a sign of strength. It began to appear more like a mask, a way to keep people from seeing what was happening beneath the surface. But what was it? And was he capable of something far darker than anyone imagined? Sarah was determined to find out. It was another quiet afternoon when Sarah sat down with the sheriff, reviewing her notes from the past few days. There were inconsistencies in the stories that had been told, and the mounting tension between the involved parties was palpable. The sheriff looked at her, his tired eyes betraying a mix of concern and weariness. Do you think David is guilty? Sheriff Whitaker asked, his voice low. I don't know yet, Earl, but everything points to him being involved in some way. Carla's affair with Jason Mitchell, the fact that David was right there when the accident happened, the lie about his whereabouts, it all fits into a pattern of someone trying to hide the truth. Sheriff Whitaker leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. I don't like the sound of that, Sarah. David's been here a long time. His family's been in this town for generations. He's done a lot of good. This whole town depends on him. That's not easy to ignore. I know, Sarah said, her voice tight, but I can't ignore the facts either. The question is, what's the real story here? What happened between him and Carla? And where does Jason Mitchell fit into all this? The sheriff sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. It's a tough one. The whole town's in shock. No one wants to believe David could do anything wrong. But that's why you're the one on this case, Sarah. We'll have to keep digging. There's something we're missing. Sarah's phone buzzed, interrupting their conversation. She glanced at the screen and saw that it was a message from the medical examiner. It was about Carla's autopsy results. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. This could be the breakthrough she had been waiting for. I need to go to the morgue, Sarah said, her voice urgent. I'll be back soon. The morgue was a cold, sterile place, the smell of disinfectant filling the air. The county's medical examiner, Dr. Lena Hayes, was going over some paperwork when Sarah walked in. Dr. Hayes was a no-nonsense woman in her late 40s, with short black hair and sharp features. She'd been working in the morgue for years and had seen her fair share of tragic deaths, but she was always professional and thorough. Deputy O'Connor, Dr. Hayes said, looking up from the documents on her desk. I've got the autopsy results for Carla Thompson. I'm sure you've been waiting for them. I have, Sarah said, walking over to the table. What did you find? Dr. Hayes flipped through the papers, then looked directly at Sarah. Well, I've got some good news and some bad news. The good news is that Carla's cause of death is clear. She died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with the injuries she sustained from the truck hitting her. There's no question about that. Sarah nodded, but she could feel her stomach tighten. The bad news was still to come. And the bad news, she asked? Dr. Hayes's face became serious. There's something else I found. Carla was HIV positive. Sarah's breath caught in her chest. She had not expected to hear that. What do you mean? How did she? I don't have all the details yet, Dr. Hayes said. But based on the test results, Carla had been living with HIV for some time. The disease had advanced to the point that she was showing signs of full-blown AIDS. But here's the thing. There's no evidence that she was receiving any treatment, no doctor's prescriptions, nothing. This is someone who either didn't know or didn't care to seek help. Sarah's mind raced. She had no idea Carla had been sick. And if she had been hiding it, there was no telling how long David had known about it, or whether he had been the one to infect her. How long had she been living with this? Sarah asked. Dr. Hayes adjusted her glasses and flipped through the paperwork again. Based on the viral load, I'd say she'd been infected for at least a year, maybe more. But there's no way of knowing exactly when or how she contracted it. The fact that she wasn't receiving treatment complicates things too. But the timeline of her condition is pretty clear. That means Sarah's voice trailed off as she processed the information. David could have been infected too. That's a possibility, Doctor, Hayes said, her voice thoughtful. You need to get a test on him as soon as possible. If Carla was infected and she didn't tell him, it's entirely possible that he didn't know. But it also makes the situation more complicated. Sarah ran a hand through her hair, her mind racing. If David had been unknowingly infected by Carla, it could explain the anger he had been feeling, the betrayal, the heartbreak. It would also explain why Carla had been so secretive about her affair with Jason Mitchell. Did she know she was sick when she started seeing him? Had she infected him too? I'll follow up with that, Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. Thank you, Doctor. Hayes. The medical examiner nodded, but her expression remained serious. Just remember, Deputy, the virus doesn't care about your feelings. It's dangerous. And if David's been hiding something about his health, there's a lot more to uncover. Back at the sheriff's office, Sarah was feeling the weight of what she had just learned. The news about Carla's HIV status had complicated everything. The deeper she dug, the more tangled the web seemed to become. There was no way to know exactly when Carla had contracted the virus, or whether David knew about it before the affair. But one thing was clear. Everything had changed. As Sarah sat at her desk reviewing the new evidence, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Rachel Martin, Carla's best friend. I need to talk to you. It's about Jason Mitchell. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the piece she had been missing. If Rachel had information about Jason, it could be the key to unraveling the entire story. She quickly typed a reply and arranged to meet Rachel that afternoon. Rachel was waiting for Sarah at a small coffee shop on the edge of town. The moment Sarah walked in, Rachel stood and waved her over. She looked more anxious than Sarah had ever seen her eyes darting nervously around the room. Rachel, what's going on? Sarah asked, sitting across from her. I've got something to tell you, Rachel said, her voice trembling. I've been keeping something from you, something about Jason. What is it? Sarah asked, leaning forward. Rachel took a deep breath, then finally spoke. I know how Carla contracted HIV. The revelation hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. As Rachel spoke, everything started to fall into place, but it also raised more questions than it answered. The twists and turns of the case were far from over, and Sarah could feel that she was now entering the most dangerous phase of her investigation. Every new detail was like another layer of the onion being peeled back, revealing a truth far darker than she could have imagined. The weight of Rachel's revelation settled heavily on Sarah as she sat across from her mind racing. Rachel's words had just shifted the entire landscape of the investigation. Jason Mitchell had known about Carla's HIV status. Worse still, he had been the one who infected her. And that wasn't the end of it. Rachel's confession added a layer of complexity Sarah hadn't expected. David Thompson, the man who had been the pillar of this tight-knit community, was not the only one who had been betrayed. It was clear, now that this entire tragedy was tied together by secrets, lies, and heartbreak on every side. Rachel was shaking as she continued, her voice trembling with the weight of her guilt. Carla, she was in love with Jason. I didn't want to believe it at first. She told me she'd broken up with him, said it was just a fling, but I knew her too well. I saw the way she looked at him when she talked about him. I knew something wasn't right. Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding. You said you know how she got HIV. How did it happen, Rachel? Rachel hesitated, as if considering how much she should say. Jason, he didn't tell her. He didn't tell her that he was infected before they started sleeping together. He had been with other women, and I think he was hiding his own status. Carla, she didn't know, and I'm pretty sure he didn't use protection. They didn't talk about it. Carla was so caught up in the affair, in the passion she never thought to ask. By the time she found out, it was too late. Rachel's words sent a chill through Sarah. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together in ways she hadn't imagined. Jason Mitchell had caused this, but it wasn't just the affair. It was the deception, the carelessness, and the disregard for the consequences. And now it was clear that David had been caught in the middle of it all. Why didn't Carla tell David? Sarah asked, though she already had an inkling of the answer. Because she was scared, Deputy. She didn't want him to know. She thought she could hide it, that she could keep it a secret from him. But it ate at her. That's why they fought. It wasn't just the affair. It was everything she had kept from him. The guilt, the lies. She couldn't handle it anymore, Rachel said, her voice breaking. She told me she was going to confess to him, but she didn't know how. She was afraid of how he would react. And Jason? Sarah asked, her mind still processing everything. Did Jason know that she was going to confess? Rachel looked away, swallowing hard. I think he did. He knew she was starting to feel guilty, that she wanted to come clean. He was terrified she would ruin everything for him. I don't think he realized how far Carla had fallen for him until it was too late. Sarah absorbed the information, piecing the final parts of the puzzle together. It was clear now that Carla's death was not just a tragic accident. It was the culmination of a tangled web of betrayal and deceit, an affair that had spiraled out of control, leading to tragic consequences for everyone involved. But where did David fit in? And how did the crash itself tie into all of this? I need you to tell me everything you know about the day of the crash, Sarah said, leaning forward. What happened right before Carla's death? Rachel wiped tears from her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. She was scared, Deputy. She knew Jason was involved, but she was still married to David. She had a life with him, but she also knew Jason could never give her what she wanted, what she needed. She was conflicted, torn between the two of them. That day, she told me she was going to tell David everything. She couldn't live with the lies anymore. She knew he'd be hurt. She was afraid he'd hate her forever. Rachel paused for a long moment, and Sarah could feel the silence in the air, thick with the weight of secrets. I don't know exactly what happened when she left to meet him, but I know David was furious. He must have found out about the affair. And when she showed up, trying to talk to him, I think he snapped. He was angry, Deputy. The kind of angry I've never seen before. Maybe that's when it all went wrong. Maybe when she told him everything, he lost control. Sarah's heart raced as she connected the dots. David Thompson, the man she had believed to be the victim in all of this, had snapped. His anger had gotten the best of him. But the deeper she thought about it, the more Sarah realized the full scope of David's rage. There was more than just betrayal and humiliation. There was the added element of fear. Fear that his life, his family, everything he had built was slipping away from him. And it was in that fear that he had made a decision that would change everything. The investigation was moving faster now, pieces falling into place. The more Sarah dug into David's actions, the clearer the picture became. David had found out about Carla's affair with Jason. He knew about the HIV. And when Carla tried to come clean, it pushed him over the edge. His anger was overwhelming. In his mind, the only way to deal with it was to make sure she would never leave him, to stop the inevitable confession. The day of the crash, David had seen Carla and Jason together, but he hadn't confronted them directly. No, he waited. He waited until Carla was alone, driving to meet him, to tell him the truth. That was when he made his move. Sarah sat at her desk, reviewing the police reports as the sheriff walked in. He looked grim, his face taut with concern. "We've got everything we need, Sarah," the sheriff said quietly. "We've got Jason's full medical history, his HIV diagnosis. The timelines match up, and David's alibi is full of holes." Sarah looked up at him. "So you're saying we have enough to charge him?" "Not quite yet," the sheriff said, shaking his head. "But it's getting there. I just wanted to check in before we go public. I know how much you've invested in this, but we need to make sure we've covered all our bases." "Don't worry, Earl. I'm not jumping to conclusions, but I know what I'm looking at," Sarah replied, her tone steely. David Thompson murdered his wife. The following week, Sarah stood in the courtroom, watching as David Thompson sat in front of the judge. His eyes were hard, his face as composed as it had been the day he'd been arrested. But Sarah knew that the man before her was not the same one who had once been the town's beloved pastor. This man was a killer, hiding behind the mask of righteousness. The trial was a blur of statements, testimonies, and evidence. The key point of contention was whether David had intentionally run over Carla with his truck. The prosecution argued that David's actions had been deliberate, motivated by rage and fear of losing everything. The defense claimed that it had been a tragic accident, an unfortunate outcome of a heated argument. But when the autopsy results came to light, when Rachel testified about the affair and the HIV diagnosis, the truth became undeniable. David had known about Carla's affair with Jason. He had known about her HIV status. And when she went to confront him, seeking redemption, he made a choice to stop her, to make sure that his secret remained buried. The jury deliberated for hours, the room thick with tension. When they finally returned, the foreman's voice rang out with the verdict, "Guilty of second-degree murder." The courtroom erupted into chaos. David's face fell, but he said nothing as the judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison. For the first time, he looked like a man who had lost everything. The weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. Sarah sat back in her seat, exhaling a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Justice had been served, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a sad ending to a story that had been filled with betrayal, lies, and irreversible consequences. She knew the town of Harmony would never be the same again.